My mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye at Thanksgiving dinner, set down her wine glass, and told her son, my husband, that he deserved better than a woman who married him for his money. Everyone at the table laughed. A few even nodded along. My husband, Daniel, just stared at his plate and said nothing. What none of them knew was that I wasn't living off his money. He was living off mine. And by the time dessert was served, I'd already decided exactly how this was going to end. My name isn't important for this story, so I'll just tell you what happened, and you can decide for yourself what you would have done. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, hit subscribe. These stories only get more satisfying from here. I met Daniel almost 6 years ago, at a mutual friend's engagement party in a rented rooftop space that was too cold for how everyone was dressed. He was standing near the drinks table, looking mildly out of place, and when I asked if he knew the couple, he said, "Not really, I just came for the free food," which made me laugh harder than it probably deserved. He was funny in a dry, understated way, a little awkward. He worked in operations for a mid-sized logistics firm, managed a small team, drove a car that was 10 years old and perfectly happy about it. He had no idea who I actually was. That wasn't an accident. I'd grown up watching money change how people treated my mother after my father's business took off. One year, we were an ordinary family in an ordinary neighborhood, and the next, distant cousins were calling to catch up. My mother's old coworkers suddenly wanted to grab lunch, and everyone had a business idea they thought she might want to invest in. She used to say that money doesn't change people, it just removes their reasons to hide who they already were. I believed her. So when I built something of my own, when I eventually took over my father's holding company, I promised myself I wasn't going to let it define every relationship in my life before that relationship even had a chance to be real. So when I met Daniel, I told him I worked in operations too. That wasn't technically a lie. I just left out which company I actually ran, and what operations meant when you're the one signing off on it, rather than reporting up to someone else. We dated for 2 years before he introduced me to his mother, Carol. In hindsight, I think some part of him knew how that first dinner would go, because he spent almost the entire car ride over coaching me on things to avoid. Don't bring up politics. Don't ask about her divorce from Daniel's father. Don't mention that we'd talked about moving in together. She'd think it was too fast. I remember thinking it was strange that a grown man needed a briefing before introducing his girlfriend to his mother. I should have paid closer attention to what that meant. Carol disliked me from that first dinner, but never in an obvious way. She was too polished, too controlled for that. It came out in smaller things. She'd compliment my dress and then add, "It's nice that you can find such affordable pieces that still look put together." She'd ask where I grew up, and when I told her, she'd nod slowly and say, "Oh, that's a very practical part of town," like it was a diagnosis. She brought up Daniel's ex-girlfriend more than felt casual, a woman named Whitney, whose family apparently had a lake house and old money manners, according to Carol, delivered with a pointed little smile in my direction every single time. Daniel always brushed it off the same way. "That's just how my mom is. She'll come around eventually." 6 years later, she hadn't come around. If anything, she'd gotten more comfortable saying things out loud that she used to only imply. By the time Daniel and I got married, I was 3 years into running the holding company my father had built, and I had since restructured, quietly, without press coverage, without my name attached to anything customer-facing. One of the businesses under that holding group happened to be the logistics firm Daniel worked for. I want to be honest about this part. I didn't plan that. It was already sitting in the portfolio, one of maybe 14 companies, years before I ever met him at that rooftop party. When I realized the connection, early in our relationship, I had a choice to make. I could tell him immediately, or I could make sure my name never touched anything he'd interact with day to day. No board memos with my signature, no all-staff emails, nothing that would put 2 and 2 together, and let him keep working there, keep earning his own way, without that shadow over it. I chose the second option. I wasn't hiding a crime. I was hiding a headache I genuinely believed neither of us needed. For years, it worked. Daniel got promoted twice on his own merit, worked hard, complained about his commute like anyone else, and had absolutely no idea that the woman who cooked him dinner every night technically outranked his entire executive team by a significant margin. I liked that version of our life. I liked being loved for reasons that had nothing to do with a balance sheet. That Thanksgiving changed things. Carol had hosted at her house that year, which she did most years, and had gone through 2 full glasses of wine before the turkey even made it to the table. She started in on Daniel's most recent performance review, which hadn't gone quite the way he'd hoped. A promotion he'd expected had been delayed by a quarter for reasons that had nothing to do with him personally, just a broader hiring freeze during the restructuring I mentioned. Carol didn't know any of that context. She just decided, out loud, at a table of 12 people, that his career stalling out had something to do with being distracted at home. I let that one go. I'd learned a long time ago that engaging with Carol directly just gave her more material. But then she turned to me, set down her fork with a little more force than necessary, and said she'd always worried, and she wanted to say this gently, out of love, that some women married for stability rather than for love, and she sincerely hoped that wasn't the situation here. The table went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone's waiting to see if the target is going to cry or fight back. I did neither. I kept my voice level and said I really didn't think that was a fair thing to say at a dinner table, in front of family, about a marriage she'd only ever seen from the outside. That should have ended it. Instead, Carol leaned back in her chair, smiled the tight little smile she saves for moments she thinks she's winning, and said, "Well, I just find it convenient that the one time we brought up a prenup, you two got so quiet about it." There had never been a prenup conversation, not once, not with her, not with anyone. She'd invented an entire memory, out loud, in front of 12 people, purely to make a point she'd clearly been sitting on for years. I looked at Daniel. He was staring at his plate, jaw tight, saying absolutely nothing, not defending me, not correcting his mother, not even quietly reaching for my hand under the table the way he usually did when things got tense. Just silence. That silence told me more than anything Carol had said. I finished my glass of water, thanked Carol for hosting, said I wasn't feeling well, and left before dessert. Daniel followed me out to the car, apologizing in that soft, conflict-avoidant way he always defaulted to. "You know how she gets. I'll talk to her, I promise." I told him I didn't want him to talk to her. I wanted him to have said something at the table, in the moment, instead of rehearsing an apology for the car ride home. He didn't have a response for that. We drove home mostly in silence. If you're enjoying this story so far, like the video and subscribe for more stories just like this one. New videos every day. Now, here's what she didn't know. I need to be honest with you. Up until that dinner, I hadn't planned to reveal anything. I liked my privacy. I liked that Daniel had fallen in love with me before he knew what I was worth on paper, and some selfish part of me wanted to keep that a little longer, maybe forever if I could manage it. But there was already a restructuring scheduled for the following month at the holding company level, a change in reporting lines that would require formal, in-person disclosure of ownership to senior staff at each subsidiary, including Daniel's firm. That timeline had been set for weeks. It had nothing to do with Carol, nothing to do with that dinner. I just made one change to it. I moved the disclosure meeting up by 2 weeks, and I made sure I would personally be the one presenting it. For those 2 weeks, I let everything look completely normal. Carol sent a message in the family group chat about healthy boundaries in marriage, clearly aimed at me without ever using my name, the kind of passive message designed so that if you called it out, she could say, "I wasn't talking about you. Why would you assume that?" I didn't respond. Daniel mentioned, almost proudly, that there was a big meeting coming up at his company, some restructuring announcement from the parent holding group. Nobody at his level really knew the details yet. I told him that sounded like a big deal and asked if he was nervous. He said he was, a little. I felt a small twist of guilt about that, And then I reminded myself what he'd let happen at that dinner table, and the guilt settled somewhere I could manage it. The morning of the meeting, I wore the navy suit I usually reserve for board calls and outside investor meetings, kissed Daniel goodbye like it was any other Tuesday, and told him good luck. He said, "Thanks, wish me luck with the mystery meeting," and I said, "You'll do great," which was true, and also not the whole truth. I drove to his office 30 minutes ahead of him, met privately with the general counsel and 2 outside board members to confirm the agenda, and took a seat at the head of the small conference room before any of the staff filed in. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, still glancing at his phone, and sat down 2 rows back with a group of colleagues he clearly knew well. He didn't look up front until the general counsel began speaking. "Before we start the restructuring overview," she said, "I'd like to formally introduce the majority shareholder of the parent holding company, who will be presenting the new reporting structure to all of you directly." Then she said my full name. My actual full name, the one on every filing, every deed, every signature that had quietly kept this entire company running for years. And beneath it, my title. I watched Daniel's face change in real time. Confusion first, the kind where you assume you must have misheard something, then recognition, slow and physical, like the floor tilting slightly under a chair. Then something closer to disbelief, the specific look of someone rapidly rerunning the last 6 years of their life through a completely different lens. 2 rows down, in the small section reserved for family observers who'd requested to attend, sat Carol. She'd asked to be there weeks earlier, apparently to support Daniel through the uncertainty of a restructuring she assumed might threaten his job. I want to be clear. I hadn't arranged that seating. That timing, I promise you, was simply not something I could have planned better if I'd tried. I kept my presentation entirely professional. Reporting lines, transition timelines, no acknowledgement of anyone in the room beyond what the agenda actually required of me. But when I opened the floor for questions, Carol raised her hand, slowly, like she'd never once needed to raise her hand in a business meeting before in her life, which she hadn't, and asked, with a slight tremor in her voice she was clearly trying to control, how long the family had held this position at the company. I looked directly at her and kept my voice exactly as level as it had been at that Thanksgiving table. The holding company has held this position for 11 years. I've personally run it for the last 4. Before that, it was my father's. I paused, and then, because some part of me genuinely couldn't help it after weeks of holding this in, I added, "I believe we discussed prenups at a dinner a few weeks ago. For what it's worth, there wasn't one. I never thought I needed one." Nobody laughed this time. A few people near Daniel actually turned to look at him, and he sank slightly lower in his chair, somewhere between mortified and stunned. The rest of the meeting went the way meetings do. Questions about timelines, a few nervous laughs at things that weren't actually jokes, the general counsel wrapping up with next steps. Carol didn't ask another question. She sat very still for the remainder of it, staring at a spot somewhere on the table in front of her. Daniel didn't say much on the drive home. He started 3 or 4 sentences and abandoned all of them somewhere in the middle. Finally, near our exit, he said quietly, "You could have told me." I told him I'd wanted him to marry me before he knew what I was worth, because I needed to know, for my own sake, that he'd chosen me and not a number. "I just didn't expect," I said, "that I'd need to prove that to your mother, in a board meeting, to finally get you to stand up for me." That part landed harder than the reveal itself had. I watched it land. "Before we get to how this ends, I want to know what you would have done in her position. Would you have revealed everything at that dinner table, or waited like she did? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one of them." Carol didn't call for almost 3 weeks. When she finally did, it wasn't really an apology, not in the way most people mean that word. It was a careful, meandering attempt to recontextualize everything she'd said as simply looking out for her son. A mother's natural worry, nothing personal. I let her talk. I didn't need her to grovel or perform contrition she didn't feel. I needed her to understand, in whatever way she was capable of understanding it, that the version of me she'd decided to disrespect at that table was never the whole picture, and that underestimating people, especially the people you've decided are beneath your attention, tends to catch up with you eventually, usually at the worst possible moment. Daniel and I are still married. Things are different now, though not really because of the money. That was never actually the point, for either of us. It's different because that whole situation forced a conversation we should have had years earlier about him defending me in the moment instead of apologizing for his mother after the fact, once it was already too late to matter. He's better at it now. Genuinely better, not just performatively. Carol still slips occasionally. Old habits don't disappear overnight, but she chooses her words far more carefully these days. Funny how quickly that changes once someone realizes the ground they're standing on isn't quite what they assumed it was. I never needed anyone at that table to be impressed by what I'd built over the years. I never even wanted them to know, if I'm honest. I just needed one person to stand up when it actually mattered. In the moment it mattered, not afterward in a car. It took a board meeting and a room full of strangers to finally get there. But we got there. And some days, that's enough.